Camera's going, is it? Yep.
Yeah.
Good. Okay. All right. So, show you where to get notes here. So yesterday we basically just got to Vienna. Is that correct?
We covered it.
Google Drive, and then we are going to academic hero. Well, that would be helpful. So go to Google Drive, go to your Unit 6 folder. All right. So at some point by the end of maybe Wednesday next week, we will be done with all of that. And this will make sense in a nice orderly way. So go to Unit 6, and then go to Notes, go to Isms Notes, and there's actually, I think it's just Isms. Let's see if this works.
It looks like it.
No, it's not it.
There's one there off of the third one down, the PDF. APRisms.
APRisms? Yeah, that's got to be the one. Okay, yeah, that looks good. And this is kind of how we're going to approach it. All right? That you could kind of create this framework around each of those, like if you were to write it as an essay, per se. So general premises, that means just basic characteristics of what conservatism was in the 19th century. Dominant periods, meaning when did we see conservatives and when were their voices the loudest. Social class representation, meaning are there particular social classes that seem to adhere to those ideas, and then finally voices. And that's where kind of like the meat of those paragraphs would come from, where you have specific figures that are writing specific works that are espousing whatever that ism happens to be. And that's how we'll approach it with the conservatives. And then remember what I said was that the liberals of the 19th century are broken into two pieces. So we're going to look at classical liberalism today. We might get to modern liberalism, but I doubt it. But at least I can explain why there was a transition. All right. So the conservatives we introduced yesterday, that is the Congress of Vienna. Those folks, the people, the Vons and the Deus and all of those folks that were there, the mega idea that we talked about yesterday. What does mega mean? Make Europe great again. That's their logic. That there is a structure that existed in the 1700s that made sense, and that the French Revolution was a really unfortunate and violent disruption of a system that had really been in place for a very long time. So the section in this reading, and I'm going to read some sections to you just so that you can get an idea of what collectively they stand for. All right? And it says the value of tradition. All right? Meaning that the conservatives believe that things like monarchy, or things like, aristocracy, or the old feudal structure, because it had been in place for as long as it was, that there was some value to it. It's a tried and true institution. All right? And that, unfortunately, a whole bunch of kind of wet behind their ears ideologues come along because they learned some things in the Enlightenment, and now all of a sudden they want to tear those roots out of the ground and kind of set things adrift. And they said they don't have any experience doing the things that they're doing, and they're basing all of their changes on these abstract concepts like liberty, or equality, or the rights of man, or whatever it is. And you can't do that. It doesn't resonate, so people don't really know how to adapt to it. So you take 2,000 years of history, you rip the shreds out of it, and then you say, in its place, we are going to put all these abstract concepts, and we are going to reorganize society around those abstract concepts. And that's why the conservatives said, if you really look at the French Revolution, that's why it was as tumultuous as it was, and that's why it ultimately dragged the rest of Europe into war. Okay? So that makes it sound a lot cooler than we live in this fantasy land that says we can go backward 40 or 50 years and live as things were. The Leave It to Beaver of the 18th century Europe. That there was a time when things were really cool, where we had aristocrats and peasants, and that sort of thing. Okay, so the first thing that they mention here is that they had hostility towards the French Revolution. Right? They saw it as a real, I don't know what you want to call it, a very dangerous experience. So they said, entranced by the great discoveries in science, the philosophes and French reformers believed that the human mind could transform social institutions and ancient traditions according to rational models. Progress through reason became their faith. Dedicated to creating a new future, the revolutionaries abruptly dispensed with old habits, traditional authority, and familiar ways of thought. It said to the conservatives, who, like the Romantics, venerated the past. They saw value and they saw good. They were nostalgic about the past. This was supreme arrogance and wickedness on behalf of the enlightened philosophers. They regarded the revolutionaries as presumptuous men who recklessly severed society's links with ancient institutions and traditions and condemned venerable religious and moral beliefs as ignorance. By attacking time-honored ways, the revolutionaries had deprived French society of moral leadership and opened the door to anarchy and terror. One of the leading voices in this was Edmund Burke. And there's a work of his called Reflections on the Revolution in France. It's almost like he predicted that this was going to happen. All right? He wrote his work in 1792. This is before the Jacobins. This is before the Reign of Terror. That he said this is what's going to happen. All right? So Burke writes, he said, you began ill because you began by despising everything that belonged to you. When ancient opinions and the rules of life are taken away, the loss cannot possibly be estimated. From that moment, we have no compass to govern us, nor can we know distinctly to what port we steer. So it's almost like there was this big anchor, And of course the enlightened philosophers believed that anchor was a bad anchor. It was an anchor that was born on ignorance and tyranny and prejudice and superstition. And they said, we have to get rid of those things if we're ever going to progress as a society. But they ignored the fact that it was in fact an anchor. Okay? It kept the boat where it was supposed to be. And it's almost like these guys were a bunch of wild pirates that are like, yeah! They just took a machete and cut the anchor, and now the boat is like flying out in the middle of the ocean. It's like, don't worry about it. We've got Locke, and we've got Smith, and we've got Montesquieu. We'll be fine. And then all of a sudden there's like icebergs around and a whole bunch of other stuff, and they're like, we're going to crash. And then Robespierre pops up and is like, and then all of a sudden guillotines, start raining down from the skies. All right? And Burke could have said that was going to happen. He's like, when you cut the anchor and then you go blindly into the abyss, you don't know what's going to happen. I mean, for Christ's sakes, Kyrie Irving would fall off the earth. Right? Because the earth is flat. Exactly. All right. The philosophers and the French reformers had expressed unlimited confidence in the power of human reason to understand and to change society. While appreciating human rational capacities, conservatives also recognized the limitations of reason. They saw the revolution as a natural outgrowth of an arrogant Enlightenment philosophy which overvalued reason and sought to reshape society according to abstract principles. Conservatives did not view human beings as good by nature. That's the other thing. Remember Locke said, human beings are good. And Burke's kind of like, What about that reign of terror thing? You know? Are they really good by nature? You know? I mean, Robespierre, his mind was so jacked up that he believed that violence was the highest stage of reason. You're like, what? Are you kidding? That makes no sense at all. And he said that's precisely the point, because you assume that rational actors are going to carry us in these careful, calculated ways, as if like Newton was every single revolutionary. Like, no, that's not who was running the show. There were sans-culottes that were running around butchering nobles if they could get their hands on them. All right? And he said that's why we had authoritarian societies. That's why we have things like the church, to try to keep some of those instincts and some of those passions tempered to a place where society can function. All right? It says conservatives did not view human beings as good by nature. Human wickedness was not caused by a faulty environment, as the philosophes had proclaimed, but lay at the core of human nature, as Christianity taught. Evil was held in check not by reason, but by tried and tested institutions, traditions, and beliefs. Without these habits inherited from ancestors, said conservatives, sinful human nature threatened its social order. And then the final part, which was, because monarchy, aristocracy, and the church had endured for centuries, they said that they had worth. Right? The fact that they made it as long as they did says they have value. Now, the Enlightenment would have said, well, that's because of the sheer power and the control that they had over the people. That once people became emancipated and believed that they had the capacity to reason and that they could transform their own thing, that would change. Right? So that's kind of the battle. Right? And when we get to the classical liberals, that's the answer. Okay? And that doesn't mean that everybody then says, like, okay, conservatives, you're right. Human passion dictates over human reason. We need to be controlled. No, not everybody believed that, and the bourgeoisie in particular was not going to believe that. Okay? Says, for conservatives, God and history were the only legitimate sources of political authority. States were not made, rather they were an expression of the nation's moral, religious, and historical experience. No legitimate or sound constitution could be drawn up by a group assembled for that purpose. Scraps of paper with legal terminology and philosophical visions could not produce an effective government. Instead, a sound political system evolved gradually and inexplicably in response to circumstances. It was revolutions never make any sense, they would say. Evolution makes sense. Things organically that change over time and adjust according to circumstances. Can somebody get that really quick? Just say we're doing something right now.
Mr. Clemens is he available at the moment?
No, he's not.
He's not available at the moment. At the end of class.
Okay. Anyway, so the last part then is to look at some of the voices, and all of them in one way or another, and in their own way, are saying what we just said. They have this kind of mindset, and it was probably best articulated by Edmund Burke, who wrote that work called Reflection on the Revolution in France. And there was a French theorist, his name was Joseph de Maistre, and his work was called Essay on the Generative Principle of Political Constitutions. Those are the thinker, the theorist part of the conservative movement. Metternich is sort of like the living example of conservatism in power. Remember, he's the leader of the Congress of Vienna, and he's going to be the loudest voice for this ideology that says, like, for Europe to be able to make it out of the abyss of the French Revolution and Napoleon, it's going to have to get back to those so-called tried and true institutions. And he was on guard every time, like, semblances of the French Revolution started to pop up. That's why the Holy Alliance and the Quadruple Alliance and the things that we talked about yesterday, because they said it's a dangerous ideology, all right, that gets these people all excited. And we have to be on guard for that. All right. The other guy, which is someone we'll talk about later, his name is Pope Pius IX. He's an interesting character. But during his time period, Italy had become very nationalist and had been working towards unifying the peninsula. And certainly that unifying Italy under one government was going to come at the expense of the Pope that controlled a lot of territory in central Italy, the so-called Papal States. So he stood on guard against that, but he became a very, very strong advocate about changing really anything. He's the most reactionary Pope of the 19th century for sure. Right. He was even going to post this, I guess we call them bulls, right? Papal proclamations. His was called Syllabus of Errors, more or less admitting the same thing that Boniface VIII had admitted in 1302, that when the Pope speaks, the Pope is speaking on behalf of God. It's as if God's voice was speaking. In other words, the declaration of papal infallibility. If that was preposterous in 1302, imagine how much more preposterous it would be in 1864. But there you go. All right. So Roman Catholic Church, the old monarchs, the old nobles, those are the folks that would identify with the conservatives. But you have to admit there are some arguments that they're making that kind of make sense, especially if you look at the darkest parts of the French Revolution. You know, there is some logic to that. Do these folks really know what they're doing? What they're good at is overthrowing the old order. What they're not good at is figuring out what to do next. And that's why the French Revolution, when they got rid of absolute monarchy and Louis, that they seemed like they were constantly re-experimenting with what they wanted to be, because they really weren't sure what that was. And then they ended up with tyranny again, and then in the form of Napoleon. So they said, maybe you ought to go back to what has worked for thousands of years, and that would make more sense. Okay, now let's take a look at classical liberalism. This one's pretty easy, because that is the Enlightenment. All right? General premises and dominant periods, and I will read at least a couple of sections on this. But for the most part, when we look at like the American Constitution, when we look at the Declaration of the Independence, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, that's what classical liberalism really is. It's the 1-2 punch from John Locke on one side on the political end and Adam Smith on the other side, on the economic end. It's the value of the individual. Okay? So if conservatism is the value of tradition, theirs is the value of the individual. The idea that the individual is, despite what the conservatives will say, is a good and rational and reasonable actor. That if they are reduced, or the constraints that tie these folks down, if they're reduced and allow individuals to be able to use their reason to make better lives and better people, all right, they believe that society as a whole will improve. Okay? So when we talk about things like the individual rights, freedom of speech and assembly and freedom of religion and freedom of this and freedom of that, that's classical liberal. They do believe that there should be political constitutions, all right? That there needs to be a set of laws that kind of bind all people together, all right? They also need to believe that those constitutions hold sovereigns accountable, whatever that government happens to be. All right, that it can't be like a patriarch, that it is literally a servant of the people. Does that kind of make sense? All right. So I wrote down some of the names, but certainly you're familiar with the ones that we've been talking about. Adam Smith in particular. Does anybody have any questions at all about what Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations means? There he is, right on time. Okay. We're videotaping today, Chanukah, so maybe if you could hover a little bit lower than you normally do. There you go. Okay. So here's what it says. The liberals' primary concern was the enhancement of individual liberty. They agreed with Immanuel Kant that every person exists as an end in himself or herself and not an object to be used arbitrarily by others. If uncoerced by government and churches and properly educated, a person could develop into a good, productive, and self-directed human being. Liberals rejected the legacy of the Middle Ages, the classification of an individual as a commoner and an aristocrat as something better. You know, the idea that birth created some type of hierarchy just simply by being born. Remember, they believed in tabula rasa. They believed that everybody should start at the same point, and that if you could, improve the institutions that shaped individuals and allow them free exercise to use their reason, that they can become whatever it is that they want to be. All right. Liberals attacked the state and other authorities that prevented individuals from exercising the right of free choice, interfered with the right of free expression, and blocked the individual's self-determination and self-development. They agreed with John Stuart Mill, British philosopher, who declared that over his own body and mind, the individual is sovereign, that the only purpose from which power can rightfully be exercised over any other member of a civilized society against his will is to prevent them from harming other people. It's called Mill's harm principle. That's really it. Okay? Otherwise, it's maximize liberty. Okay? So, they said, to guard against the absolute and arbitrary authority of kings, liberals demanded written constitutions that granted freedom of speech, the press, and religion, freedom from arbitrary arrest, and protection of property rights. They are big-time property rights advocates. That's where the Locke and Adam Smith stuff comes in. Okay? Property holders are stakeholders, and they wanted the protection necessary to protect what's theirs, and then also provide the protection so that they could pursue the accumulation of property. To prevent the abuse of political authority, they called for freely elected parliament and distribution of power among the various branches of government. There's your Montesquieu. Liberals held that a government that derived its authority from the consent of the governed, as given in free elections, was least likely to violate individual freedom. Okay? And then this is the other part, which is important. Bourgeois liberals, these are these folks, viewed with horror the democratic creed that all people should share in political power. To them, the participation of commoners in politics meant a vulgar form of despotism and the end of individual liberty. They saw the masses, uneducated, unpropertied, inexperienced, and impatient, as lacking both the ability and the temperament to maintain liberty and protect property. That's maybe where the conservatives and the classical liberals have some commonalities. As they said that passions ultimately would be the undoing of whatever good might come out of political society. So there you have that. Okay. Okay. The other thing that you get out of this, and I'm going to read like 5 people to you right now, but there's like a couple of core principles. The one that we talked about, the kind of thing that you would have seen in most of the Enlightenment work. The Holy Triad, John Locke, Adam Smith, Baron von Montesquieu, right, that provide an economic and a political template for what they look for. They believe in written constitutions, they believe in individual liberties, they believe in the codification of laws that protect people's rights. All right. The other part is that they believe that government itself should kind of stay out of people's way. All right, allow individuals the capacity to pursue their interests. Like I said, with Mill, they're just trying to keep people from harming other people in the pursuit of their interests. All right? But the other part of classical liberalism, which really kind of aligns it with modern conservatism, is that the only equality that we're really talking about here is the equality of opportunity, or legal equality. All right? That everybody, because there is no more distinctions based on birth, there is this assumption that everybody, excuse me, starts from the same place. And I'll get into that a little bit later. But as long as the laws are the same for every single people or every single person, regardless of who they are, and as long as people can advance in society without any arbitrary barriers that prevent them from advancement, then they believe society is free and equal. Okay? Sexual equality, they're probably not talking about it yet. All right? Economic equality, they sure as hell are not talking about that. Okay? What's mine is mine. There's very much this belief in that. And that's really one of the sad parts of the core of this capitalist, classical liberal ethic. All right? If you're poor, we talked about this before, when we were looking at the excesses of the Industrial Revolution, you're just not trying hard enough. And there are going to be some people out there that are preaching that. When we talk about middle class values or bourgeois values, they believe that anybody that works hard, that saves their money, all right, that lives a good life, that stays out of the taverns. Remember, that's where the link between Calvinism and capitalism is. You're good, hardworking, pious people, that there's no way in hell that you can be poor. All right? You will advance. As long as you've eliminated all of those artificial encumbrances, that government can protect you and provide you legal and equality and equality of opportunity, then if you don't succeed, it's on you. All right? So the Benjamin Franklin, the Poor Richard's Almanac, that's an expression of classical liberalism. All those little adages. Early to bed, early to rise, makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. A penny saved is a penny earned. A stitch in time saves 9, right? Save your money. Okay? Work hard. Get up early. Go to bed early. All right? Don't spend your time in prostitution halls. Don't spend your time in taverns. Okay? Don't hit the clubs. All right? Work. All right? Think about the next generation. Invest. All right? Those are classic liberal values. All right? Samuel Smiles is another one that comes up. You'll read maybe these are some of the articles you can read for your next PSD. But he had 2 works. One was called Self-Help, and the other was Thrift. Doesn't have to be more self-explanatory than that. That adage, the Lord helps those that help themselves. You even think about that mathematically. If they're already helping themselves. Anyway. All right? But the idea is this, and if anybody's ever heard it, pick yourself up by your bootstraps. Stop blaming everybody around you for your conditions. Start doing for you. All right? And then you've got 2 people that come along, and I didn't talk about them in detail, but they're the ones that were looking at population, and then they were also looking at how poor the wages were for working class people. Right? They're part of this group of, I forget what it's called, maybe it's like the English School or the Manchester School of Economy. But they're sort of like doom and gloom people. Thomas Malthus wrote a book called Essay on the Principle of Population. He was looking at the dramatic increases in population from the beginning of the 18th century to the end. Right? There's a very kind of easy characteristic here. All right? He was looking at population growth and saying this, that if you have food supply, food grows linearly, arithmetically. Okay? What that means literally, just for math, is that it grows like this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, does everybody see that? That when you're looking at population growth, it grows like this. All right? So instead it would be like 1, 2, 4, 16, something like that. And that at some point there would be an intersect line where he's arguing that the population will outgrow the food supply. That's where the real pressure on resources happens, where you get into water wars, and you get into the idea that there's not enough food to be able to supply the people. And then food prices might shoot way up. And then people will starve to death. Okay? That's all it's a prediction. All right? When people say they're Malthusians, they believe that there is this dire disaster on the horizon where there's going to be so many people in the world that ultimately the world is going to be in real bad shape because we have ultimately outproduced our resources or our capacity to get those resources. And he doesn't see any way to fix that. And the reason that he believes that this is the case is because poor people breed too much. Okay? He's an economist, so he probably doesn't use those terms. But that's the synopsis. The only thing that can stop this dire warning that the population is going to outgrow the food supply is somehow if poor people, people that can barely make it day to day, stop producing kids. Okay? And he doesn't think they can do it on their own. This is another thing that you probably hear some crass freaking idiot, conservative that might say, well, if they just stop, having babies, they'll be able to make, a living. You can't feed all those babies. Maybe you got to stop having babies. All right? So some, kind of ignorant person that makes those arguments is a Malthusian. Makes him sound a hell of a lot smarter, doesn't it? Okay. The other person that we're talking about here, his name is David Ricardo. Ricardo is another economist. His work is called Principles of the Political Economy and Taxation. Right? 1817. His argument is this thing called the iron law of wages. Because there's a movement out there that said, why can't we give workers more money? Why are they basically earning enough to just barely survive? It seems to me like that's exploitation. The factory owners are making billions of dollars worth of profits, and then these poor workers are making barely enough to feed their families and keep the heat on. Can't we do more? And his argument is, that's like basically taking money and throwing it into the toilet. And his logic is that poor people, if you give them a little extra wage, because they don't do what Benjamin Franklin suggests you should do, which is like a worker gets a whole bunch of money, okay? Like, oh my God, look at this paycheck. Like, I am going to go and set up a Roth IRA. No, they're going to go to the bar. They're going to be like, holy crap, I got a raise. Drinks for everybody. Okay? They get a little lit. They go home. The missus is there. They make babies. Okay? The more babies they have, the larger the labor supply becomes. The labor supply gets larger, the demand for labor decreases. What happens to wages? If the demand for labor decreases, then people are going to be willing to work for less money. Okay? It ultimately drives the wages down. Until you always get to a point where there's just enough money to survive. Okay? It's kind of weird because Malthus is saying even if they are poor, they're still going to have more kids. All right? So Ricardo's saying, no, it's kind of like pinned to the wage. But they said if you pay anything above subsistence level, you're guaranteed that there's going to be an increase in the population, which will ultimately drag the wages right back to where they were. All right? Doesn't make a lot of sense, but his argument is still the same. Poor people breed themselves into poverty. Okay? Does everybody kind of get where the classical liberals are? All right? This is the bourgeoisie. Property owners, property holders, those are the ones that are the movers and shakers. And after the Industrial Revolution, this is the top of the food chain. These guys are the new aristocrats. The factory owners, the bankers, the financiers, the shippers, the builders. All right? They're kind of running things. They're going to start gaining more seats in representative governments. Okay? The British Parliament, the Chamber of Deputies, whatever it happens to be. Okay? The American colonies, that is like a haven of bourgeois people. There's poor people too. But really the classical liberal thing is the agenda. So how does it change? How do we get from that version of liberalism to a different version of liberalism? Does anybody remember the proximity discontent argument that I gave you? When we looked at working conditions in the Industrial Revolution, what did you see? You saw people living in squalor. You saw people living without any decent health conditions, any decent sanitary conditions. Environmental conditions were bad. The factories were horrors. Okay? There was no protection. They were working long hours. They were getting paid very little. All right? But remember, there is an oppression that exists in a very overpopulated and condensed space. And the argument is a pretty simple argument. If classical liberalism is not adaptive in any capacity and just says, it's your fault, you're poor, you deserve to be poor because you're not trying hard enough. And the people say, we are doing everything that we can. We don't have decent schools. We don't have decent housing. We don't have health care. We don't have daycare. We work insane hours. There's child exploitation. There's women's exploitation. There are so many things that are done. But yes, you're right. Capitalism is flourishing in this particular environment. And somebody is going to get wind of the fact that there is insane amounts of profits that are being gathered and concentrated in the hands of very few people. And that the masses themselves, I told you, so bad in some places that the life expectancy was less than 20 years old. That doesn't seem like that's an ideal place. Okay? So you got one of two alternatives. Either the people that are now in charge, and I told you that the classical liberals are the ones that are starting to run things during the Industrial Revolution, and that the poor working class people are on the other end, they're on the receiving end, they're the exploited. That you have one or two things that you can do. Either A, you can lighten up and start providing some things to give them a better quality of life, or they're going to run you over. Are you kidding me? I'll just let it ring. Okay? And that's what ultimately happens. You get to a place, and this is roughly around the 1840s, where the isms will shift. And the reason why the isms will shift is not coincidental. At the same time that we see classical liberalism shift to modern liberalism is because we see the rise of socialism, we see the rise of anarchism, and we see the rise of Marxism. And those are movements that are basically taking the poor masses and saying, we're going to have a revolution and we're going to overthrow this order. And if we don't act, okay, if we don't act and act quickly, that's going to be the result. We are going to face violent revolution. So, is it so hard to then maybe consider providing higher wages or shorter work days or some type of sanitary law that is going to keep excrement from building up in people's homes or on people's streets, or providing elementary education for children so they have a place to go and start building, their minds instead of working in factories and hunched over machines. And so we get to that. And in the middle of the 19th century, there's going to be some voices for that. Edmund Cartwright, we've already talked about. Okay, the guy that really started it is a guy named Jeremy Bentham. Anybody ever heard of Jeremy Bentham? Has anybody ever heard of utilitarianism? Okay, what is utilitarianism? The AP Euro abbreviated version. That's it. If you can remember those words, you pretty much got it. The greatest good for the greatest number. Essentially, what he's arguing is that society is sort of measured by its utility. Okay? And the utility is measured by the amount of pleasure that exists in society and the amount of pain. And that an ideal society is where the greatest number of people possess the greatest amount of pleasure. and the fewest number of people possess the fewest amount of pain. And what they saw was that in the the highest stage of the unfettered, unregulated bourgeois capital world, factory owners and exploited working class, that all of the pleasure was concentrated in the hands of the very few. And all of the pain was shared by a great number of people. And so what his argument is in all of these guys, when you say liberal, there is a tie that binds. They do still care about individual liberty. They still care about individual freedom and freedom of speech and assembly. And they do believe in constitutional governments. Okay? But where they kind of take a break from the classical liberals is in the role that government should play. All right? In the classical liberal world, government plays a very small, limited role. Laissez-faire. Stay out. Let people do their own thing. All right? The util people are going to say no. The government needs to step in. Because if the haves have everything and the have-nots have nothing, all right, there is an imbalance that exists in society. And if the ultimate goal is to try to get the greatest good for the greatest number so that society is really functioning at its best capacity, then government needs to step up and try to redress that imbalance in some way. Okay? Tangible ways. How do you do that? Workplace protections. Okay? Investing in education. All right? Protecting the elderly, protecting the handicapped. All right? Providing some type of insurance so that people, if they get hurt on the job, that they have some way of being able to continue to feed their families while they're recovering from being hurt. All right? Things like that. Okay? Putting standards on or environmental regulations on factories. Limiting the amount of time that people have to spend working in loud, machine ear-cracking factories. Okay, being able to drink water that is not contaminated by lead, or any other thing. That's all things that modern liberals would say ultimately will produce better outcomes for the masses, the people. And then if the masses are looking at revolutionaries and saying, we got to take over, and they said, you know what? Society's much better than it was. Then maybe the idea that revolution is the only answer, maybe that doesn't make as much sense. Okay? So the modern liberals, slowly but surely start to give some things, to the poor, to the working class, and maybe that balance gets a little bit better. All right? But society nowadays is a clash. It's a clash between how much modern liberalism, how much classical liberalism. Because if you do too much modern liberalism, it gets accused of being socialism. And depending on where you are, socialism is either something that said, yeah, that's cool, I like that, I embrace that. Or socialism is an evil. Okay? In Europe, socialism is not really seen as an evil. In the United States, it's seen as an evil. Okay? You use words like socialism, that the people's alarms go off. Okay? Because they've been inundated with the belief that the poor help themselves. Okay? And that if they tried harder, then I wouldn't have to take all of my valuable tax money and give it to them. Does everybody kind of understand? I mean, these are how the dividing lines were made. Okay? And part of it is just how you believe the world. Are you more of a Bentham and Cartwright and Mill type of person? Or are you more of a Smith, Malthus, Ricardo, Smiles, Franklin, Locke kind of person? Okay? And that might determine where you are on the political spectrum. Okay? Do you see socialism as an evil? And we're going to talk about that. That's the next thing to come. All right? Or do you see it as maybe a good? Do you believe human nature to be predatory and lazy? Or do you think human nature, if the institutions that shaped individuals were truly corrected to allow for people to flourish? Who's to say. Remember, I think it was the other day. Rachel, you can hit stop time because the bell's about to ring. Thank you. You don't have to clap.